is Chapter 18, Introduction to Your Body, from the cells, the tissues, and just the terminology that we will use as we continue through the rest of this book. This is on page 341, the definitions of anatomy, physiology, pathology, and pathophysiology, as well as homeostasis. All of these definitions I want to make sure that you are familiar with, especially when it comes to homeostasis, because each of us is very unique. A little overview on terminology. Just how the root, the prefix, and the suffix are all going to be different. And if you look on pages 342 and 343 and onto the top of 344, just some different tables that will help you. I have several textbooks that are just all different forms of terminology. But what I want you to notice is for the prefix, the root, or the suffix, there can be different meanings. So keep that in mind as you journey forward in wherever you're going that your body takes you. This begins on page 344 with a lovely picture that you can see that's on page 345. The different levels of our body, our organ systems, you definitely need to be familiar with. On page 344, it lists out the levels of organization from the least complex to the most complex, and that's what is pictured on this slide, as well as page 345. Please make sure that you know these from the least complex to the most complex. Down in the second paragraph, where it starts out with the chemical level, there's also some terms, the cortex, medulla, and lumen. These are parts of organs or structures that will come into play later on in this course, but here is the basic introduction of what those terms mean. Under the cells and the cellular process, we have the definition of what a cell is. The smallest structural and functional unit that can be self-sustaining and exist. On the bottom of page 344 is an overall view of the cell structure. The cells. Again, please make sure you know the definition of what a cell is and what it needs in order to survive. As I mentioned, on the bottom of page 344 is that table that has the cell structures listed along with their functions. The picture that you're seeing on this slide is on page 346, and everything about this you want to become familiar with. I do want you to be familiar with the gel-like substance, the cytoplasm. I want you to know where the organelles are within the cell. The endoplasmic reticulum, where that's located and what that looks like. Then next into the ribosomes, those small little granules that have our RNA located within them. On page 347, we have the definition of the Golgi body, so just those separate little sacs that are pictured here. The mitochondria is the power of our cell, so know where that mitochondria is. The lysomes, the little pieces that have broken off from those Golgi bodies. The centrals, those structures that are helping the cell to divide. And then in the very center, we have our nucleus. This is the largest part of the cell, sometimes thought of as the brain, but it needs all of these pieces in order to move and to stay alive. On the top of 347, we have the cytoskeleton. This is just how this whole thing comes together. They have referred to it as the scaffolding material so that this whole cell can stay structured. But within that, we also have the definition of the microvilli and the cella. I want you to be familiar with all of those terms. So now we're going to talk about how things actually happen within the cell. So there is a cellular process that is passive, meaning that it does not require energy or activity within that cell membrane. And this is how things inside and the cell is going to move. We have different types of activity that can happen. Diffusion is defined on page 347, but as I have noted here, the picture that goes along with that is on page 348, figure 18.3. So you can just see with that little process of diffusion where things that are very close, they have high concentration and then they break down or go to low concentration. Osmosis definition is on the bottom of page 347, with the picture being on the bottom of page 348. So this is just where it's going to move across and basically go from low concentration to high concentration. And then our last type is filtration, that's defined on page 348. And we can think of filtration when we are straining something, or we have a strainer and we're running water through it and it's being filtered. So filtration is probably the easiest process that we can think about. But this is just how things move in and how the cell moves around our body. On the top of page 348, we have the active process. So this is when the cell has to expend some energy in order to move, whether it's within itself or around in our body. But it has to be pushed in order to do that. There's some way that this has to happen. So it has to be active. So the transport by pumps is a pumping action that is moving it forward. But we also can have cells that are transported by vesicles. So we can think of that as a vehicle. So it maybe was attached to something. But there's different ways that this process can occur. We have exocytosis and endocytosis. Please be aware with both of those. And then also, we have some cell eating and cell drinking terms. So phagocytosis on the bottom of page 348 and the top left-hand side of page 349 for pinocytosis. So yes, our cells need to eat and drink, and they get inside of a vesicle and they move around. Tissues is the next part up. So when we look at our least complex, we know we have cells, and then we come to tissues. So tissues is just a group of cells that are acting together and are performing in the same way. So our body is just a bunch of cells. So our tissue layers, as you can see on the picture on the bottom of 349 or in this slide, these are just particular types of tissues that are formed together. There are 4 different types or principal types of tissue: epithelial, connective, muscular, and nervous tissue. Epithelial is defined on page 349, and then we'll move into the rest of those in just a moment. But there's a couple things that I want you to note also on page 349. On the right-hand column, we have the interstitial fluid. So this is what is the in between the spaces within the tissue. We also have tissue that has different times that it has developed within our body. So in that third paragraph on the right-hand side on 349, we have ectoderm, mesoderm, and endoderm. I don't have a particular picture on this page that I can show you, but we're going to look at that in just a moment. Here's the little bit of information that I mentioned on page 349, that fluid that is in between the cells or in between the tissues. And then as far as the picture of what ectoderm, mesoderm, and endoderm, it is on page 350, and you can see the different types of tissues that are layering within our body. Just that different type of ectoderm, nervous tissue, mesoderm, muscle and connective tissue, and the endoderm, which is the epithelial tissue. Remember, there are four principal types: epithelial, connective, muscular, and nervous. I've arranged these slides. Hopefully it'll be a little bit easier for us to remember things instead of just exactly how it's pictured in the book. So the first type of tissue of our principal types was the epithelial. So you can see here that I have that it is lining the different internal structures and body cavities within our body. It has a specific function: protection, absorption, secretion, excretion, sensation. But let's look at a picture of where these are. So if you look on page 352, you can see all the different types of epithelial tissue. So inside our lungs, inside our bladder, just the different areas that this particular type of tissue is located. And I have listed here also the classifications, which you can see those also on that picture on page 352. Our next type of principal tissue is connective tissue, so supporting and transporting and defending our body. The picture that goes along with these types of connective tissue is on page 353, and you can just see this is our bone, this is our cartilage, this is our adipose tissue, our fat tissue. So all these different types of connective tissue, which are really supporting and holding up our entire body. One of our hardest type of tissues that we have in our body is our bone. The definition for our bone, the compact and the spongy bone, is on page 354, but I have referred you to page 371 if you want to see a picture of what the bone looks like on the inside, but that will be coming up in chapter 19. So just a little overview of the bone. Also within that connective tissue, we have cartilage, and probably you have heard of cartilage. The definitions are on page 354, but we do have different types of connective tissue cartilage: hyaline, fibrocartilage, elastic cartilage. They all do different things, and they're located in different places throughout our body. Another type of connective tissue is blood. Maybe you didn't think of blood as being a connective tissue, but it is. It's a liquid connective tissue. But in chapter 26, we will go over more aspects of the blood, what's inside of it, how it's created. So we'll deal with that more, but just become a little familiar with blood being a liquid connective tissue. Muscle being our next connective tissue. This is defined on page 354, but we know we have different types of muscles: our skeletal muscles, our cardiac muscle, and our smooth muscle. Nervous tissue or nerve tissue. So this is within our brain, our spinal cord, and of course our nerves. The picture you're seeing here on this slide is what's pictured on page 356. So you can look there, but in chapter 23 we will dive very deep into the different types of nerve tissue and nerve cells. But I just want you to be aware that this is a type of tissue that's located within our body. When we injure ourselves or we have some sort of healing that needs to happen, tissue repair of all of these types of tissues has to occur. And there's different reasons why different types of tissues repair the way that they do. And one of the ways that that happens is through inflammation. So on page 355 is the definition of inflammation. This little funny picture here of how our body is supporting itself. This is pictured on page 357. So just those different signs and symptoms of inflammation, you definitely need to be familiar with these 5: the swelling, the heat, the loss of function, pain, redness, all of those different types. When our tissue does have an injury, some sort of damage to it, there is several different processes that our cells have to go through in order to regenerate and just repair itself. The epithelial tissue itself rapidly divides and regenerates very quickly, and there's different processes that have to happen in order for our body to repair itself. So this picture, which on the slide is on page 357, is just how this healing process is occurring. And this happens without us even knowing it, and microscopic levels that we're not even aware that this is happening. But depending on our body is how quickly those tissue types are going to heal. So here's just a few of the different ways or factors that are going to affect it. One other thing that is not on here, which I think of, is hydration. So maybe take this time and drink a little water. Just like with the different types of tissues that are within our body, we have different type of membranes. So just sheets of tissue that are covering and protecting different areas, internal and external, within our body. And they're kind of anchoring all of the structures together. So on the bottom there, you see we have cutaneous, mucous, serous, synovial, meningeal. These are pictured on page 358 is what I have on the slide here. So it's just giving you a little overview of those different types of membranes that we have within our body. Please be familiar with all of them. Beginning on page 358, we're going to quickly go through some of the different terms of how we refer to our body. It is something that every healthcare professional, no matter what field you are in, you will need to be familiar with that. So all of the anatomic positional terms is just how we are holding our body. The anatomic position is how we always refer to any person, whether they are standing up, laying down, whether they're prone, supine, whatever it is. This anatomic position, which is written out on 358 and 359, you also need to make sure that you memorize everything about it. The way that we divide our body into dimensions is further divided into up and down, left to right, front to back, which is the planes of our body. So we have the sagittal, which is also the median plane, the frontal, which is also the corneal plane, and the transverse, which is the horizontal plane. I want you to be familiar with how these divide up the body. And then later on, you will need to be familiar with, in another chapter, we'll talk about what movements are made within each of these planes. So this is a good introduction to try to definitely be familiar with these terms. Starting on page 359 and on to page 360 is just some directional terms that you definitely need to begin to use within part of your speaking. So it's not just left and right, superior, inferior, interior, lateral, etc., superficial, deep. All of those terms you definitely need to know. Body cavities is another distinction that you need to be familiar with. So you need to know the dorsal cavity and the ventral cavity. This picture is on page 362, but the definitions are on page 360. At this point for this course, you just need to be familiar with these 4 abdominal quadrants. On the bottom of page 362, it does go into further. You can divide the quadrants up even more, but please at least be aware of these 4 to begin with. And the rest of the terms that we have in this chapter, beginning on page 361 with the axial skeleton, and also then the appendicular skeleton. So if you look through those pages all the way up to page 365, just all of those different terms for the upper extremity, the lower extremity, knowing the difference between axial and appendicular, all of those areas. And I know it seems like a lot, but there's a lot of these that you're going to be familiar with. Probably you don't need to study that the facial is the face, but perhaps the axillary being your armpit, that's one that you need to put into your terminology.